Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series, along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. This is the first episode of our second season, and I am joined again by regular guest Brian Stout as we discuss Mad Max and the video game crash of 1983. Hey everyone, Vince here. Before we get into this episode, I just want to say that any financial support you can throw our way would be greatly appreciated. Because this podcast is based on a college course and its primary purpose is to be educational, I don't want to commercialize it. I feel strongly that knowledge and education should not be commercialized. However, I am more than happy to accept donations. Now, we're still going to make the podcast because we enjoy doing it, and we're always going to do it for free, so don't worry about that. But if you want to support us, you can click on the link in the show notes, and we'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s, Season 2. We're starting Stranger Things 2. And note that Stranger Things does not call itself Season 1, Season 2. It's constructed or presented as if it's a movie or a novel. So Stranger Things Season 2 is technically just Stranger Things 2, which I think is a really cool thing. I'm joined again by my friend Brian Stout. Brian, do you really want to introduce yourself again?
I'm sure everybody is pretty familiar with me by now because I'm on here constantly.
Right.
But just in case, Brian Stout, I live in Bloomington, Indiana, which isn't far from Hawkins, as you probably figured out. You know, learning consultant by day. I like to do a lot of freelance writing and pop culture geekery on my free time.
What was your most recent piece that you wrote on pop culture?
Well, I actually, just this past week, I put an article out on the website Pop Matters, which is a pop culture academic criticism site. Talked about a record that is near and dear to my heart by a band called The Promise Ring, and the record's called Nothing Feels Good, which I'm sad to say turned 25 this year, which made me feel just terribly old and sad. It's a really fun record, and it's a pretty important record as far as emo goes. It sort of crossed over into outside of that genre into some other spaces, and it's a pretty well-regarded record. The site is Pop Matters, and if you just look for me on there, it's around.
Awesome. Track him down, give him a like and subscribe. Speaking of feeling old, just recently I had an experience that made me feel old. I'm working at a job now where I'm a writing consultant. Formerly, I was a teacher of English and literature and writing. I've transferred into a writing consultant position. And the other day, I was listening to one of the other consultants work with a student analyzing an article that Roger Ebert wrote. And the article mentions Conan O'Brien. Neither the other consultant nor the student knew who Roger Ebert or Conan O'Brien were.
Oh, my. Wow.
Right. The consultant knew that her grandmother used to watch Roger Ebert on TV, which killed me.
Well, that sounds really good.
And she knows that Conan O'Brien is a podcaster.
Oh, yeah. I thought you were going to say barbarian, but I guess, yeah. I mean,
Oh, she wouldn't have gotten that reference.
yeah,
But
that's probably way too.
yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Oh my goodness.
these
Yeah.
damn kids.
It's too bad Roger's not around. I bet he would have a killer podcast.
So, hey, Brian, let's talk about video games. Are you a gamer?
I have been at various stages of my life. I'm starting to kind of dip my toe back in there because I have some children that are curious. So I bet we'll be buying a Switch in the near future. I think the kids will really be into it too. I keep saying that because I'm almost afraid to buy it though because I work from home. And so I'm a little concerned that I might just go down the rabbit hole, miss a meeting or something like that. I did buy one of those newer systems that just has a bunch of classic games preloaded on it. So my son and I have been playing that.
The classic
Yeah,
system. So
I've got a one of those. It's like the SNES version.
Yep, the
my
mini
son
classic.
is,
Yes.
Yeah,
I've got one of
is
those
all
too.
in on that. That Ninja Turtles 2, like the fighting side scroll fighting game.
Oh
He
yeah,
loves
the
that.
classic arcade fighting game.
Yep. Yeah,
Yes.
we're all in on that. That's what we're playing these days. That and a little bit of Mario, of course.
What's your history with playing games as a kid?
Well, I really got into them in the Nintendo Entertainment System era. So like I think it was probably like sixth grade, I think, when I got that system for my birthday or holidays. And then at that point I was all in. I mean, that was pretty much the only thing I spent any money on. I'd go rent games, buy games, read magazines about games.
Yes.
And then that just continued all the way through to Super Nintendo. I was all in on that. And then I think once I could drive, then that's when I started going to see more bands. And then I kind of switched over to more CDs than video games. But
that's
but I dabble.
That's similar to my experience because when I was a teen, I was a gamer as a kid. I kind of got that from my oldest brother. My first game console was the MADMAX Odyssey 2.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
I had a friend who had one.
In fact, I still have the one that we had because my oldest brother, who was really into games and always has been, he bought it around 1979, 1980. And then he gave it to us younger kids when he upgraded to the Intellivision. So I was really into games when I was young. And then when I was in my teens, I fell off from games. And it wasn't until I was in college that I kind of got pulled back into it, thanks largely to Tomb Raider. But that matter of video games is really relevant to this season of Stranger Things, and particularly this first episode of MADMAX. And I want to talk a little bit about the video game crash of 1983. You probably heard something about the E.T. video game.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar with that.
What do you know about that?
Well, it's generally regarded as the worst video game ever, I think.
It's technically not, but you're correct, and that it's generally regarded as such. And many people blame it for the downfall of Atari and the video game industry in the early 80s. I should specify that, yeah, there was an industry crash in 1983, but that only pertains to the United States. It didn't really affect the rest of the world, most notably Japan, which becomes important later on.
Wow,
so
it's amazing to think that poor old ET could bring down the entire industry.
And here's the thing, it really didn't. There were other factors involved. ET was really just kind of the final straw that caused the collapse, but it had been building up for a long time prior to that. Have you seen the documentary Atari Game Over?
Oh, a long time ago. Yeah, I did see that. It's been a long time. When did that come out? It feels like it must have been like 10 years ago or something, right?
Something about close to that, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely remember seeing it. Yeah, I think that's where I learned about the ET fiasco.
Right, which is basically that documentary talks about the history of the ET game, and the downfall of Atari and the role it played in that. But also it focused very heavily on the excavation of the landfill in New Mexico, where all of these games have been buried. So here's what happened. The first home video game system was the MADMAX Odyssey in 1972. And although it was really an amazing technological advancement for the time, very primitive by modern standards. And even within a few years, it became obsolete after Atari released their console that's come to be known as the Atari 2600 in 1977. And Atari as it was just known as, just the Atari, was innovative in that it was one of the first consoles to use interchangeable cartridges, whereas the Magnavox Odyssey had basically the games hardwired into it, whereas with the Atari and other consoles of that particular generation, the games were on cartridges that you could swap out, and so that created a much larger library of games that could be played. And it was incredibly popular. And it should be noted that there were other consoles of the time other than the Atari, such as the Odyssey 2, which is what I had when I was a kid. That was my first console. But Atari was really the king of the hill when it came to home video game system. And they thought they were untouchable. And that's where they made the mistake. There was a lot of hubris in their approach to the video game market. They made a couple mistakes in terms of legal issues. The company Coleco made their own video game system that was basically a knockoff of the Atari system. And Atari tried to sue them, but what they found out is that they had no legal standing to back it up because the hardware that made up the Atari system was all off-the-shelf technology. So it wasn't proprietary. And once that decision was made, that kind of opened up the floodgates for other companies to make their own knockoff Atari systems that were, let's say, inferior. Another problem that they ran into was that the games were also not proprietary. So anyone could make a game for the Atari system if they wanted to. And many, many, many people did. Often you get these so-called studios made up of one or two people who were just making really crappy games in order to cash in on the popularity of Atari. And what was happening is these really inferior games, which came to be known as shovelware, because basically it was just crap that was being shoveled out the door to make a quick buck. Consumers started getting pissed off about this and stopped buying these games, which meant that there was all this inventory on store shelves that stores couldn't sell. So that's a big part of the situation of what happened with the industry collapse. And then ET comes along. Because what was happening is Atari, after these legal losses, and they're losing money on games that retailers are not ordering from them because the retailers couldn't move them, they wanted to come back with a blockbuster game. And E.T. was a huge movie. Steven Spielberg was known as a gamer himself, so they decided to partner with Steven Spielberg to make a game based on E.T. to sell for the Christmas season. And they were so confident in how successful that this was going to be that they paid Spielberg so many millions of dollars. And they made a deal with retailers who were reluctant to carry the game, that made an unprecedented deal with them saying that, hey, don't worry about it. This game is going to sell like gangbusters. And we're so confident in this that we will buy back any copies of the game that you do not sell.
Oh, wow.
The next problem, the designer of the game, a software engineer named Howard Warshaw, was only given 6 weeks to make the game. And to his credit, he did make the game, and it was a functional game, even though it's mind-boggling how much time he had to spend putting into it. He gave up sleeping and eating and stuff like this just to make the deadline. And to his credit, he did make a game that is functional. And it's a game that's not as bad as people think it is. It's not a great game by any means, but it is a game that you can spend some time wasting time playing this game. But it wasn't the game that consumers were promised, because they were expecting this blockbuster game that was going to be awesome. And what they got was a really mediocre game for the holidays of that year. And the reaction was so bad that people started returning the games to the stores. And the stores couldn't move them. So they went to Atari and said, hey, remember when you said you'd buy back all of these copies of the games that we couldn't sell? Well, here you go. And that's what destroyed Atari and ultimately the industry itself.
Wow. That's interesting, because as you rolled out all of those things, I remember because I was so thoroughly obsessed with Nintendo once I got into it, I'm thinking to myself, I'm sure that Nintendo, everything that you told me that they did, Nintendo had already built a plan and to sidestep every
Yes.
single one of those things. And it's just funny to see that it's interesting how they learned a massive lesson from that Atari failure because of the
Exactly.
licensing of the games. I saw a handful of bootleg games when I was a kid,
Yes.
and they'd usually be a kind of like a disreputable video store for rent.
Uh,
Cartridge would be like blue or something.
yes.
It fit in the thing, but it wasn't even like the practical, like the standard issue looking
Exactly.
like gray brownish colored cartridge. And
Exactly.
that's how I
And
first played
so,
Tetris though. So I'm not gonna dog it.
so yeah, the industry completely collapsed in the US in 1983. And yet today, video games are more popular than ever, more profitable than ever. It's the leading entertainment medium, certainly in the US. So what happened there? What turned that around? And you're right, it was Nintendo. First of all, like I said, the industry collapse was only in the US. It didn't affect Japan. And there were companies in Japan, such as Sega, that was making a go of it, making video games. Nintendo, which had been in business for 100 years at this point, they were a toy company. They originally began as a company that made playing cards, and then they moved into making toys and electronic toys. And that's one of the keys to their success, is that they never viewed themselves as an electronics company, and today they even still don't. Today they still view themselves as being toy makers as opposed to game designers. And so one of the keys strategies to their success was marketing their home entertainment system, known as the Famicom, or the family computer in Japan, known in the US as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. They marketed it to children specifically as a toy, unlike Atari and these other companies had. Another key to their success, apart from the hardware being a generation beyond what Atari had made, was, as you point out, the games themselves. They had such a stranglehold on what games made it to their platform. They built into the NES a lockout chip system that prevented any non-authorized cartridges from being able to play. Now, some companies were able to get around it, which is why you point out there were these really weird colored cartridges you would find in video stores and stuff like that, the sort of bootlegs, not quite bootlegs, but were unauthorized games that were made for the system. But by and large, all of the games that were made and published for the Nintendo Entertainment System had been vetted by the company itself and literally had the Nintendo seal of approval stamped on them. So yes, because of their controls and making sure they didn't want to have inferior product released on their system, and even though there were some games that were just absolute shit at the time, sure, but they were so concerned about maintaining a high level of quality that allowed them to basically revitalize the game industry in the US and take us to where we are now. So why is it important that people know what happened with the industry crash of 83? Arguably, without that happening, we wouldn't get Legend of Zelda and Mario and all of these other classic game icons today. So, any questions? Questions, comments, concerns?
No, I was just thinking that when you said that they view themselves as a toy company, that makes so much sense because they built the brand that way. Like, it's the house of Mario, right? And the other thing that happened too is that diversification of Mario, then he's in like the side scroll game, of course, that everybody knows him from. But then there's like Dr. Mario, which is my absolute favorite game of all time.
Right.
And then there's all the other, associated things and then the toys and stuff. Like I mentioned before that I have little kids, and they're all in on Mario. They love it. And I have other friends who have kids that are, similar to my age, and their Halloween costume for this year is like son's Mario, the dad's Luigi, and the mom is Princess Peach, and
that's awesome.
The dog's gonna be Bowser, or like it's so enduring, and it is because of that quality too. And I think the other thing that sticks out to me is that you said they mentioned that they marketed it as a toy to children.
Yes.
You know, at the time, video games that were popular, it was the arcade, which is what this
Yes.
show shows a lot.
Yes.
This particular episode, but that's where everybody was, and that was mostly teenagers,
Yeah.
or people who, or kids that were old enough that their parents would drop them off, like the kids in this show.
Exactly.
And so, you know, so it really brought that to home. And then I know from my own experience, I mean, my mother got way into video games with me, so we were playing games all the time together. So it became this like bonding thing, and it's not, you know, just the spare TV in the basement that's got the Nintendo hooked up or whatever. It's
right.
like out there in the living room, and everybody's taking turns. And so it was really smart the way they did all of that.
And even if you look at the other console makers from the 70s and early 80s, Coleco, MADMAX, these companies were known for making other types of products before video games. They were just got into video games because of the immediate popularity of it. They weren't devoted to it. So it's like, you know, Coleco was the Connecticut leather company, right? They made leather products. Mattel was a toy company that came in later on with the Intellivision. MADMAX was a TV manufacturer, right? You know, Nintendo was the first company that really came along who was like, no, we're going to be a toy company. This is a toy. We're going to focus on what we know how to do. And even today, you have Sony and Microsoft as the biggest competitors. Microsoft is primarily a computer company. Sony primarily is an electronics company. They do have their gaming divisions, but they have a diversified portfolio of products, whereas Nintendo just does games. So how does this relate to Stranger Things? You were already alluding to it here.
Well, there's a lot of time spent in the arcade, and it seems like they're only listening to Devo when they're there. So it's the first thing that struck me about this season, and we were talking about this off mic a little while ago, is that the pop culture references are really heavy in this. Like there's a lot of calling out things by name. It's almost as though maybe the producers got the notes from the audience that everybody loved some of these, you know, how much care was put into like which songs show up or which things are, which posters are on the wall, etc.
Yes.
And then they just pushed that to 11. It's 1984, so I can use a Spinal Tap reference. And
dude,
so
pushing it to 11.
Didn't even think about that.
Oh, come on. You did not intend that pun.
I did not, because I looked at the 1984 and I said, oh, good, I can talk about Spinal Tap. So, yeah, but it seems like, I mean, this episode is just loaded with different references that don't, and I think the thing that really stuck out to me in this episode is that a lot of times there in the first season, or in Stranger Things 1, sorry, not season, the references seemed to have, they really had some value. They weren't just tossed off in the dialogue. Like, you know, we talked at length last season about how, you know, which posters were on the wall, which bands were played, which songs were in those were chosen, and how
there was so much meaning behind the things that were chosen.
Yeah. And here a lot of in this episode, and I'll be curious to see if this is just, if it continues to stick out for me as I rewatch. But this one is just loaded with references from this time period.
Yes.
And they're mostly just dropped into the dialogue, just like seasoning. They're not really, they're not necessarily there for any good reason other than to establish that this is the time frame.
Yeah. So just looking at some of the allusions that I put on my list, MADMAX, obviously, which is the title of the episode. It's a reference specifically to the character of Max, but of course, MADMAX is an allusion to the Mel Gibson movie of the same name. And then we get references to Centipede, Dig Dug, Ms. Pac-Man. And I think some of these are there for thematic relevance, which I will come back to. But then Asteroids, of course, they're in the arcade. You're going to see a lot of games in the background. You're going to get a lot of references to them in the dialogue. But then you also get references to Baby Faye, which I do want to come back to, The Terminator, Talking Heads, Vonnegut, specifically Kurt Vonnegut, Atari, Bowie, David Bowie, Kenny Rogers, Mr. Mom. That's just the ones I listed, right?
I thought Steve looked a little bit like Michael J. Fox in Teen Wolf at times, but I think that's a little early.
And there are some visual references. For example, the part where Will is having the vision of the upside down outside his house and the door swings open. I mean, that's straight out of Close Encounters, right? So yeah, there are some visual homages.
I'll tell you one thing that they referenced, and I'll have to double check this, but did people actually use the term KFC in 1984?
I don't think they did. I don't think KFC
so
became a thing until late 90s.
Right.
That jumped out at me because, I mean, when I was a kid, we called it Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They did get the finger licking good part right, but
they did get
when he said
part.
KFC, I thought,
I
don't think
KFC.
that was a thing until
I don't know.
later.
Maybe he was trying to be hip. I don't know. But I don't think that was in the sort of national lexicon at the time.
Truly, that trend did not start in Hawkins.
But looking at the specific games that are referenced here, they're playing Dragon's Lair. How does that relate to the story, do you think? Are you familiar with Dragon's Lair?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a major like technological breakthrough of this era. I believe, and keep me honest here, but if I remember correctly, Don Bluth is the person who did the animation for it.
Yeah, so Don Bluth had been an animator for Disney before breaking away to form his own studio. And of course, he made some iconic animated films of the 80s, The Secret of Nim, An American Tale, The Land Before Time, yes.
Oh, yeah.
So, and he produced a few games, Dragon's Lair being kind of the most well-known.
And and that game, what made this one stand apart, I think, was just that it really did look like an animated movie.
It very much did. It used Laserdisc technology.
Yeah, whereas a lot of these other games that we're going to be looking at are really pixelated.
Exactly.
Of the moment. Dragon's Lair was a massive level up.
Yeah, hand-drawn animation compared to pixel art.
Yeah. And also in the terms of the complexity of the game, I mean, if I'm looking at the ones that we've got here to talk about, Dragon's Lair is like a Hero's Quest game, more so than some of these others that just have, like Pac-Man is just,
It also costs 50 cents to play Dragon's Lair, whereas the standard was 25 cents. You drop a quarter in, and then you get like 3 lives or whatever. Dragon's Lair did cost 50 cents, which I think is hilarious that Dustin makes the joke or makes the comment about this overpriced bullshit, because that was kind of the sentiment. When you dropped in your 50 cents, you did not last long in that game, as beautiful as it was. But the story of Dragon's Lair is that classic dragon abducts the Princess Daphne, and then the knight Dirk has to go to the Dragon's Lair to rescue her. How is that relevant?
Well, we've talked at length about how this whole series has got a Hero's Quest theme going through it.
And what happened with Will?
And so Will went into the darkness, into the lair, into the upside down, and
abducted by the monster into the monster's lair.
Yeah.
And remember that his hideout was Castle Byers. That's what they called it. A little kind of tree fort from which the Demogorgon abducts him in the upside down. So he is the damsel in distress in that particular story. And they have to go into the lair of the Demogorgon in order to bring him back and save him. So thematically, I think Dragon's Lair makes sense within this particular context. How about Centipede, Dig Dug, or Ms. Pac-Man? Do you remember those games?
I do remember those games. I remember playing them all, at least to some degree. In fact, I just played Ms. Pac-Man last weekend with my daughter at a bakery here in town.
What is Ms. Pac-Man about?
Well, Ms. Pac-Man is a little yellow gobbler of dots. You got to clear the screen, get all the little dots. There are these pesky ghosts that are always after you. And if you get a certain pellet, there's 4 of them on the screen in most cases. And then if you get one of those larger pellets, then you're able to gobble the ghosts down too.
Yes. And it's a spin-off of Pac-Man, which was one of the most popular video games ever. And it's a spin-off, but it's also notable in that Ms. Pac-Man is the first female video game character. And so it is about a female character running from ghosts, making his way through a maze.
Speaking of Halloween costumes, actually several years ago, that was our family costume.
Nice.
Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man, and then we had our 2 little ghosts.
Nice. So there's some thematic relevance to Ms. Pac-Man here. And I think it's interesting in that you see Ms. Pac-Man next to Dig Dug, which is where the boys go when they realize Mad Max, whoever that is, has beaten their high score on Dig Dug. And what's Dig Dug about?
If I remember correctly, don't you just have to dig tunnels? Is it similar to Pac-Man, only you're digging instead of getting the dots?
Somewhat. You create your own mazes through digging as opposed to running through the mazes.
Okay.
But as you dig, there are these monsters that attack you, and you have to basically kill them by inflating them with an air hose. Dig Dug is about digging tunnels and fighting monsters. There is an episode in this season that is called Dig Dug for, I think, obvious reasons, or maybe not so obvious at this point if you haven't seen the full season. But yeah, the whole subterranean tunnel monster fighting stuff, that is a big part of what happens in this season's story. So Dig Dug, it makes perfect sense there. And it's interesting that the boys all had the high score until this newcomer, this new female character comes in and beats them at it. So we are introduced to a few new characters. Obviously, Mad Max, Maxine, or Max as she prefers, because no one calls her Maxine. Who else do we get?
Well, you get her brother Billy, who makes quite an entrance.
Yes.
Let's see, I was trying to think of what he was listening to when he pulled up. Oh, the Scorpions, Rocky
Scorpions, yep. And we don't learn his name in this episode, but yeah, it is Billy.
Yeah. And then you get Dr. Owens, Paul Reiser's character, and you get a little glimpse of Murray, who's, what is that actor's name? It's escaping me.
Brad Gelman.
Brad Gelman, yeah, he's great. I like
Brett Gelman,
things. And then Bob.
Sean Astin of Goonies fame and other 80s films, but the one of most relevance to us here is Goonies. And of course, Dr. Owens, Paul Reiser. Lord of the Rings, but that's later. Yeah. And then Dr. Owens, played by Paul Reiser, who, for our generation, we knew him primarily from two places, which was some TV shows that he had done in the 80s. My Two Dads, which is what I really watched him on.
You remember My Two Dads, but of course, in the 80s,
yes, he's known from Aliens 2, or Aliens, rather.
Yes.
The sequel to Alien. And Aliens is one of the fundamental texts for this particular season. We see so many references and parallels to Aliens, or we will see so many references to Aliens in this particular season. And so introducing us to Paul Reiser as Dr. Owens, the government doctor there in the beginning, if you are familiar with Aliens and his character in that, you're primed to see him as being a douchebag.
Yep.
So is he a douchebag?
Well, kind of. Not quite yet in this particular episode, but I mean, if I'm just going back to watching this for the first time, as opposed to my rewatch,
right,
I immediately thought, I know this is not going to be good.
He is presented in a way that it feels really shady. Not quite as bad as Dr. Brenner, who was a complete, sociopath.
Yeah.
Dr. Owens does present himself initially as very friendly, but there is that sinister edge to him too.
Yeah, there's just something about that character just from the jump that gives you a vibe.
Yeah. And part of it, I think, is the baggage that we kind of bring to that character based on what we know about the actor and his previous roles. So there is some intertextuality happening here, and that we're meant to connect this season's story with Aliens and Dr. Owens with his character, Paul Reiser's character in Aliens.
Yeah, it's actually quite a coup to get him, given how much this season, or this part two, leans heavily into Aliens.
And it's very interesting in that he says, I need you to trust me, because that theme of trust, which ran through the entire first season, it's stated right here in this first episode of Stranger Things 2. I need you to trust me. And if Hopper and Joyce both react like, yeah, hell no.
No.
Okay, so some other things about this episode. It begins in Pittsburgh with a completely different set of characters.
I completely forgot about that until I started watching the episode.
So we're introduced to this other whole set of characters in the very first scene. And it's off-putting because it's like, okay, we know Hawkins, we know our characters there. Who the fuck are these people? That's not what we came in for.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that you say that because this episode, one thing that I did like about it also is that it's pretty deliberate in how it lets us catch up with the characters. You know, we don't even see 11 until nearly the end of the episode.
Very end of the episode,
yeah. Very last. So it's fun how they did that to just kind of let us catch up with people. Joyce doesn't make an appearance till about. I feel like I have a vague idea of what if I can remember sort of what those folks were, how they fit into the story, but I don't.
Basically, this is a tease for these characters, and in particular, Callie, whom we'll learn more about later on in the season. But from this teaser, we learn or we see that Callie is very similar to 11, and that she has some sort of psychic ability that makes her nose bleed. And also, it becomes more evident later on, but this group of people is kind of the anti group of kids that we have here, the kind of the flip side of our group of heroes. So if our heroes are the X-Men, this is the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants.
That makes sense.
I don't know if you caught this, but when the episode begins, the first shot is a view of the night sky, and then it pans down to the city of Pittsburgh. And that shot is a reflection of the very first episode of the first season and the last episode. And that both of those episodes begin with a shot of the night sky and the camera panning down to the Hawkins lab, which is a shot that's taken directly out of E.T., by the way. That's exactly how E.T. begins. So we're immediately being set up to connect this season back to the first season, but then we're thrown off by having a completely different group of characters who are similar to our core group of heroes, but these are new characters that we've never seen before. I think it's really interesting in the way that it mixes that familiar visual element with something that is going to be new and potentially exciting. Another theme or idea that gets introduced here is the anniversary effect. And since you've got a background in psychology, maybe you can explain that.
So the anniversary effect, as it's explained in the show, is that people can have a psychological or a psychosomatic reaction to a traumatic event on the anniversary of it. And so this is part of what comes up in the scene when they go talk to Dr. Owens. Dr. Owens presents them with this concept and tells them that because it's getting close to the time, it's been about a year since Will disappeared, and so they've expressed some concerns about some of his behaviors. So Dr. Owens presents the anniversary effect as a possible explanation for that and says it will probably get worse before it gets better.
Yes. So a bit of foreshadowing there.
Yeah. I can certainly say I've had this experience personally. In my life, there's 3 major unpleasant events that all piled up on January 2nd. So as we get closer and closer to that, I get a little tense. I get a little anxious. I have to try to make a plan for myself about how I'm going to handle or that day because it does have some effect on me. So that was certainly something that resonated with me.
And it introduces the idea of post-traumatic stress. And Dr. Owens makes a point of saying, this is something we're still learning about, which was the case. What is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder has always been around. It was discussed in different terms, particularly in relation to soldiers, such as shell shock, combat fatigue, and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the concept of PTSD was a fairly new thing at that point in time, or a way of conceptualizing it as a psychological disorder was a fairly new thing.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Vince, it really started to, when we called it other things, those terms that you used were all related to war. Not that they weren't already occurring, but that seemed to really raise the interest level in the research and trying to understand it better. And you're probably going to say this next, but then as they're leaving, Hopper supports that. That we know from part 1 that this is something that's part of his life that he's struggling with as a veteran, as a person who lost a child. And
that idea of him being a Vietnam vet is never explicitly stated until a little bit later. But we do get hints of that throughout the first season. And here's another hint that Hopper is familiar with it, because as you say, as they're leaving the lab, he says, you know, that post-traumatic stuff is real. You know, how would he know that? So yeah, and PTSD began to really be looked at from a psychological angle after Vietnam and the experience that veterans were having returning back to the US after being in Vietnam.
Yeah, that tracks. This is around the time that we would have been starting to get a little more serious about looking into it. Previous to then, we would have looked for, you know, most everything was looked at as a medical issue, and there would be some sort of a medical treatment for it. You know, it wasn't until the 70s that people started to more widespread use of therapy, which, yeah, I mean, even at that point, there was still, you know, there was still a great deal of stigma around it. So I think it was really important that Hopper said, this is real, because you could certainly see lots of other people in Hawkins going like, "Well, what's that? I don't know. My dad was in the
suck
war.
It up,
he was
get over
fine.
It.
Yeah, it's no big deal. You get over it."
So a couple other details that I noticed this time that I'm not sure I noticed before. Murray says, I'm talking a full-on Russian invasion right here in Hawkins. When he's saying that there is a Russian spy, you know, a little Russian girl has been seen in town, and that's related to what happened to Barb, because he's been hired in order to find out what had happened to Barb and get justice for Barb. So after the first season, there was this social media campaign's probably not the right word, but the social media trend of using the hashtag justice for Barb, because viewers were sort of disappointed that, you know, Barb disappears and then nothing is done about it within the story, because they really liked Barb as a character. And so in season 2, the producers really tried to wrap up that story thread and get justice for Barb. And so that's why Murray comes in order to find out what happened to Barb. But yeah, he does say, I'm talking a full-on Russian invasion right here in Hawkins, which, you know, spoiler alert, is ultimately what happens in Hawkins later on.
Yeah, listen to Murray.
Yeah,
it's kooky at first, but
yeah, I mean, he comes off as a conspiracy theorist who's looking for aliens and who are probing people's butts, you know, that sort of thing, as the police deputies are kind of mocking him. But he's really onto a lot of shit here. And Hopper realizes that because when he starts talking about this girl who had been in town the previous year, of course, Hopper knows what the story is, and so he shuts it down pretty quickly. So he's trying to cover it up. So there is a cover up happening. Another detail that I noticed was when the Wheelers are having dinner, Karen is drinking wine, and she's the only one who's drinking wine. What's going on there?
You know, I didn't notice that, but I did notice that as far as the characterization of the dad, it's like, if it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? He's just spouting off these stupid dadisms still.
Yeah, cliches, right?
Yeah.
You know, in the previous season, he was completely uninvolved with what was going on and had to be reminded to say something to the kids. He's like, what did I do? So now he's trying to say something to the kids to impose some discipline, but he's doing it in a really cliched way.
Yeah. Speaking of the 80s, he reminded me almost of one of those toys that you could pull the string and it would say, you know, he had like a series
if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it too?
Yeah, exactly. I guess this is character development for her, character growth for him, I suppose.
He is more engaged in what's going on with the kids. That is true. And then in a later episode of this season, Dustin will say how completely useless he is. But yeah, and that was in terms of Karen's development. Yeah, she kind of that stereotypical suburban mom where she has to drink wine to get through the day. I never saw that until I just rewatched it. I'm like,
it registered with me, but then I didn't start thinking about it any more deeply than that. Because I got all caught up on that KFC business.
And that threw me off too. I will admit to that. We do get a couple callbacks. There is that opening shot, as I mentioned, which is a callback to the first season. Lucas is using binoculars to spy on Max. That's a callback to the first season because, you know, Lucas in his Rambo gearing up montage, he has binoculars from Nam, so he's going to use them, right? So I thought that was a nice callback. And then there's a callback in the toys because Mike is told that he has to fill up 2 boxes of toys to sell in a yard sale. And so he looks at his toy dinosaur and his Millennium Falcon, which he had introduced both of those to 11 in the first season. And by looking at those toys, it puts him into that mindset of thinking about 11 again. So some nice callbacks there.
Yeah, there's even that really nice shot where he looks kind of longingly over at where she used to stay. Yeah, it's a good scene. All I kept thinking was, don't you dare donate that Millennium Falcon.
Yeah. Oh, that would hurt. I felt a visceral pain there.
Yeah, like, no, you've done nothing that warrants that.
Yes. Some symbols and motifs. We talked about Dragon's Lair and how that connects to the story. How about Reese's Pieces? Because Dr. Owens asks Will what his favorite candy is. And Will's like, oh, I don't know, Reese's Pieces, I guess.
Did he say Reese's Pieces or peanut butter cups?
He said Reese's Pieces.
Okay.
Specifically Reese's Pieces.
Well, that's obvious. I mean, that was the... That
is it obvious? To us,
yeah.
I think it's obvious.
Okay, well,
maybe not for the audience.
In case you're not my age. So Reese's Pieces became wildly popular because of their placement in E.T. And the story goes that actually M&M's turned down the opportunity to be the candy that is eaten in the movie, and then it sort of made it Reese's Pieces explode.
Right.
But yeah, so I'm sure it's not enough, it's no accident that Mike references those.
Right. His favorite candy, Reese's Pieces. Well, of course, the E.T. connection there, or at least for those of us who recognize the significance of Reese's Pieces and how they exploded after E.T. That's a little Easter egg for us. Another symbol or motif is Will talks about how he felt frozen when he had that flashback or that flash forward. Maybe it's not clear exactly what's happening to him when he's having these visions of the Upside Down. How is that symbolic?
Well, it was amazing that they could see into 2013 and see that there'd be a movie called Frozen with these little princesses. Just kidding.
I'm pretty sure it's not referencing that.
It's not about Elsa, apparently.
Oh, let it go.
So
sorry. Oh man, that hurt to say.
I have a 7-year-old daughter, so you know I have seen that movie about 1 million times. But I mean, for me, that Frozen thing just made me think of Han Solo instantly.
Oh, so I didn't make that connection. The Han Solo and Carbonite
what
thing.
Did you? Yeah, what'd you think?
I was thinking back to the monster of this season is the Mind Flayer, who likes it cold. He hates heat. And we do see in this episode the soldier with the flamethrower burning the incursion from the Upside Down in the lab. But yeah, it becomes a sort of running, not necessarily a theme, but a recurring element in this particular season, and that the Mind Flayer hates heat. He hates it when the soldiers burn him with the flamethrowers, and he likes it cold. And so when Will talks about being frozen, I see that as maybe an element of foreshadowing to how the story is going to play out this season. So I think that the idea of being frozen is symbolic of the Upside Down and what Will is experiencing.
You're probably closer than I am on that one.
And then Barb's family, her parents are selling their house, and the real estate firm is the Woodward Real Estate Company. I'm making a connection to Watergate there.
That's the first thing I thought when I saw that name.
So what is the connection?
So Woodward and Bernstein are the two journalists that broke the Watergate story, did the investigation. There's a famous film from the 70s called All the President's Men with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman playing Woodward Bernstein. It's generally regarded as one of the great films about journalism. So those of you who are younger, if you're into things like Spotlight or some of these other films that have come out recently, you might want to go back and check this one out because it's an OG and it's very, very good.
So Bob Woodward is kind of a legendary investigative journalist who broke the story of Watergate, along with his partner Bernstein. And were meant, I think, to connect that with Murray, because they're selling house in order to pay Murray for investigating what happened to Barb. And Murray was a former investigative journalist. So I think we're meant to connect Woodward with Murray there in that particular case. So going back to these allusions, I said one of the allusions was to Baby Faye, and I wanted to come back to that. Do you remember the Baby Faye story?
Just barely. I'm actually was just looking at it right now. So it's
So in the show, it's
transplant?
referenced in the montage establishing Hawkins. The Hawkins newspaper has an article on its front page about Baby Faye's baboon heart.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. I just Googled it so I can know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1984, this child was there was a transplant of a baboon's heart to this human infant, Baby Faye.
So Baby Faye was an infant who was born with a congenital heart defect and had to have a transplant of a baboon heart. It was big news at the time. It was also really controversial, and I, like you, I had to look this up because I remember vaguely the story of Baby Faye from back in the day, but I had to refresh my memory about it. And it was controversial because the doctor who performed the surgery had some questionable ethics. For example, he didn't get full consent from the parents to perform the surgery. The father wasn't involved. The mother signed the consent forms, but the consent forms were altered after she had signed them. So she wasn't fully aware of what the risks were of the surgery. It was an experimental surgery. It was one of the first heart transplants that was sort of interspecies. They, of course, didn't have any infant hearts to be donated. So they went with an animal heart instead, in this case, a baboon. I remember from the time it being kind of an outrageous story, the idea that this baby was having a baboon heart implanted in her. But there were legitimate medical reasons for it. But it was still an experimental procedure and historic one as well. But you see that reference in the show, again, by the newspaper headline, Baby Faye's baboon heart, which sounds like something out of the National Enquirer or some tabloid.
Yeah. Yeah. This article that I was just looking at, apparently the doctor just passed away. Well, about
a few years ago.
3 years ago. Yeah, like 3 years ago. It sounds like, while this one wasn't super successful, it did spur on a lot of
and the child did
improvement,
die about a month later from rejecting the transplant. It is true that the child did live longer than anyone else who had received a heart transplant before. So there was scientific progress that was made in this, but the ethics behind this experimental surgery were questionable.
Questionable research methodology and procedures doesn't sound like it fits into Stranger Things at all.
Right?
So I wonder why they put that in there.
How does that connect? What's the relationship here? We get a lot of needle drops in this episode, some of which are anachronistic. So which ones did you catch?
Well, I think I wrote down all the ones that you put in here, but I think it's really funny that Whip It is always at the arcade that's filled with teenage boys, because it's well known that that song is about whipping a part of yourself. And
so, yeah, that song is very much connected with the arcade because it's played twice in the episode, in both instances at the arcade. Yeah, Whip It. So the classic Devo song. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the one that was the most on the nose was Just Another Day.
Boingo Boingo, Just Another Day, which is slightly anachronistic because technically it's from 85.
Yeah, that didn't, the gear didn't stick out to me, but I did think that was just such an on the nose.
Yeah.
Reference.
So that's what plays during the montage of Hawkins and Hopper going into the police station. It's just another day. We get the Romantics talking in your sleep.
Yeah, Detroit Boys Made Good.
Yes. So that plays when Nancy and Steve. Oh my God, Steve, why am I blanking on his name? So Nancy and
are
Steve are talking
yeah.
about his college application essay.
Mhm.
So talking in your sleep. Scorpions, rock you like a hurricane. Yeah, you mentioned this. This
Yeah,
is when our
Billy's big
introduction
entrance.
to
Yeah.
Billy. And I think it's an apt introduction to Billy because
Oh
he's
yeah,
very much that,
it looks like a song I'd hear him blasting out of his car.
hard
100%.
rocking, butt rock, mullet rock. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I say that with all love and affection because that's the music I listened to back in the day. But
it's
yeah,
the
you can
music
see that
everyone listened to
that's
back in the day.
well, that is true. But you can
Yeah,
see how that is associated with him. And that kind of music, which we see, later on, there are some Rat songs and stuff which we associate with him that he listens
yeah,
to. I think the show does a really good job of using music in order to reveal something about characters. So we know, for
yeah.
example, Nancy and Steve listen to the contemporary pop songs. Jonathan listens to
Mhm.
the sort of alternative rock and pop.
Yeah.
And of course, Billy comes in listening to that hard rock and, sort of hair metal.
Mhm. Yeah, I do think they do a nice job of kind of giving people their theme or their
Yeah.
like their theme songs and things. I enjoy that. That's one thing I do like about the show because if you're a music nerd like me, that sort of playing, that stuff kind of sticks out.
We get Gary Paxton's spooky movies. I
Let's
did
see.
not catch that the first few times I saw this episode. It wasn't
Is
until this
that
episode I'm like, oh, okay, I caught it.
is this the part where Joyce and Bob are making out?
Yeah,
Okay.
in
Yeah.
the store. So it's a Halloween theme song,
Yeah.
and it's an
Which
older boomer kind of song. It's a song from the '60s,
yeah,
a
yeah,
novelty song,
it was not on the charts in the 80s.
right? And so it's appropriate that that plays when Joyce and Bob are making out.
Mhm.
They're the boomers here, or some of the boomers anyway. And then we get something completely anachronistic. Prehistoric Wolves song Every Other Girl. This is what's playing on the lab technician's headphones when shit starts going down
Okay.
at the end.
Hmm.
This is a song from 2016. I have no knowledge about this particular group,
Me
partly
neither.
because I cannot find anything about them online.
Yeah, it's not anything that's familiar with me, but I certainly it certainly stuck out at me as something that didn't seem to fit
Right.
into the 1984-ness of everything.
Yeah, so I don't know what's up with that. I mean, it's a deliberate choice that they're making, but I don't know what the reasoning is behind it. So, anything else that you caught in this episode?
Now I'm trying to find out what's up with that song. Well, there's the part where Jonathan and Will are talking, and that's and this is one of the times like I said, where it feels like they just sort of tried to shoehorn in some references,
Mm-hmm.
because Jonathan makes reference to David Bowie. He has a speech that is straight out of an 80s movie that's just kind of like it's way cooler to just be yourself, and I'd rather be a weirdo, and so on and so forth. I'm paraphrasing, but and then he ends it, or one of the big takeaway statements in it was something like, do you want to be David Bowie or Kenny Rogers? And then Bob comes from around the corner and is like, oh, Kenny Rogers. I love Kenny Rogers.
Right. And Will's
And so,
reaction is Kenny Rogers, ew. Right.
yeah. Also a chicken magnet, just just as a side note, that good run of
Kenny Rogers
Challenge of the
Roasters.
Colonel with his Kenny Rogers Roasters. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't catch that. I didn't make that connection.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So,
but yeah, that little conversation,
because it was a very random reference. Like, why Kenny Rogers? I was trying to think in my head, like, was Kenny Rogers really popular at that time still? I think my thought about him as the heyday was like the late 70s.
More 70s, but there was still some happening in early 80s. He was more, I think, known as a movie star or an actor at the time.
And I was just about to say, then there was that movie Six Pack, which I would have to double check the date, but I think it's probably I feel like it's like 82 or 83.
It's in there, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely an early 80s film. Yeah. So maybe that's why Kenny Rogers was on the tip of their tongues. Oh, and then also the other part that was fun was when they're talking about the VHS, he goes to the video store and gets three
Mr.
tapes,
Mom,
and
yeah.
Mr. Mom is the one that they watch. It's also, and they make a point of showing that Joyce and Bob think Mr. Mom is hilarious, but Will and Jonathan don't like it at all.
And Bob makes the point that he hopes Jonathan doesn't get anything too scary because he doesn't like scary movies. So yeah, the whole idea is that Bob is a white bread kind of guy. He doesn't like scary movies. He doesn't like, intense music. Kenny Rogers is safe music for old people. That's a suggestion there.
Yeah, he's very Hawkins.
Yes.
Very Indiana.
Yes.
Let's sand the edges off. Yeah.
That conversation between Will and Jonathan harkens back to that first season, where I think you had mentioned this when we talked about it in that episode, where Jonathan is like, Lonnie wants Will to like normal things as opposed to stranger things. That's the contrast there.
Yeah.
And so this particular conversation harkens back to that one: is don't try to be normal, try to be a freak, be yourself.
Yeah. In fact, he says something like, people who are normal they don't do anything of significance, or
Right.
paraphrasing, but he makes the connection with Bowie. And I actually had just seen that Bowie doc like a couple weeks ago that just came out. And one of the things that really stood out about it that's interesting, I think, that just from watching it in this big chunk, I mean, everybody thinks it's off the top of your head, you think, oh yeah, David Bowie transforming constantly and everything, but it really is like a major theme of the new film. And so it was really interesting to me just see it in this little 2-hour chunk of like, this is who he was, and then this is who he, all these different journeys that he took in his career, and the restlessness and things. So it's, Bowie turns out to be, and obviously it was a perfect reference to use for what they're talking about.
Right.
But, for a lot of reasons, he also is, seems kind of alien to the rest of the world. That too. So, and that actually reminded me of another scene, or some of those other Will and Jonathan conversations where they talk about some things where Jonathan's kind of like doing the older brother thing and trying to like steer him into some cooler stuff that's a little off the radar.
So yeah, that point is made. You should be into Stranger Things, or at least that's the inference, which, as again, harkens back to the first season. I'm like, we didn't really talk too much about the significance of the title Stranger Things here, but I think that's what it means, or it has a double meaning in the show, and that, yeah, you should like Stranger Things as opposed to normal things, or at least that's one of the suggestions or themes of the overall series. But also, it's about strangers coming together in order to do something good, do something great. So it's a celebration of strangers and Stranger Things. And on that note, anything else to add?
Yeah, I'd say this episode, the thing that stuck out that I really enjoyed was the way that the pacing is very controlled. And so you're kind of, as you watch it, you're wondering when you're going to get to see people. And then as they get reintroduced.
I think
and like you said, it starts with that very big scene, that starts with the first scene. They're like, who the hell are these people?
I think it's a fun episode. I think it's well written. It's, it is the exposition part of the story for season 2. So it reacquaints us with the characters we know and love, but also intrigues us with, okay, what's going on with them now? So there's these new elements happening that we expect will pay off in later episodes. So that's it for this episode. Next time, the homework, we're going to talk about Election 84, which is right around the corner in this particular season. This is the Halloween season. It's leading into, late October, early November, which was election time of 84. And let me tell you, that was an interesting election. So we're going to talk about that next time.
Was it ever?
Along with Ghostbusters, which is another one of the fundamental text that informs this particular season of Stranger. Until then, Brian, anything to add, anything to plug, anything to promote?
No, just go read my Pop Matters article.
There you go. And I'll try to link it in the show notes. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me again, Brian. Thanks for joining us, listeners. And until next time, take it easy and stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under licensed from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.